Welcome, everyone. It is so good to see all of your faces here today. Again, Dr. Foster, welcome to this space with us. Technology is such an amazing thing, and so we love that we have this available. Thankfully, the folks who, oh, sorry. I thought, yeah, like I don't think I've ever heard my recording coming back to me. Um, Thankfully, someone has prepared notes for me. So if you see me glancing down, that's because the folks who planned this have been so gracious to get everything in order. And so make sure to reach out to someone from the Freeman Network to say thank you as well. To begin, we're going to offer a prayer together. And so if you would, please join me in prayer. Great Creator, Almighty God, enduring in grace and mercy, we gather today to listen, to speak, to ask, and to receive. Strengthen our hearts, minds, and bodies for this time and for the effort that it requires of each of us, that our conversations, comments, and questions would honor you and our common humanity. Amen. So I am Randall Keeler, pastor of Hootertal Mennonite Church, just a few miles north of Freeman. This series, though, is not hosted by my church, but hosted by Freeman Network for Justice and Peace, which is a local organization here founded by the Christian Mennonite community in this area. The Mennonite community here, though, is not just engaged with local events like this, but is involved in aid and humanitarian work and conversations like this across the world. The mission statement for the Freeman Network for Justice and Peace is to discern God's transforming voice in the church through prayer and sharing, to practice the church's prophetic voice in the world through projects that can be done locally and globally, and to discuss possible opportunities for action concerning issues of peace and justice, so that we see them in our community, of course, and around the world. Even though this organization is founded by Christians and based on the church's teachings, we welcome anybody of any walk of life who shares the same values of justice and peace. If anyone is interested in being involved with the network, you can, of course, put your name and information down on a sign-up sheet there. This is the information desk. And if I can kind of direct your attention that way, there are suggested donations for any of the books on the table. But that is just suggested if you do not have the funds available today to take a book, you are welcome to have one. And so please make sure to look at any of the resources on the table to continue your own reading and learning about these topics. We also have a donation box, which I want to direct your attention to. And if you can, please support this ongoing work, because this is actually the third of 5 presentations that we hope to have about Israel-Palestine. This series is titled Challenging the Myth of the Israel-Palestine Narrative, a Community Conversation. As the title implies, we here at the Freeman Network for Justice and Peace believe that the current story about the history of Israel, Palestine, their relationship, and the realities of life in those areas is in many ways a myth. There is some truth to the story, but otherwise the commonly held understanding of the situation is largely false. Our intention for this series is to challenge that myth. We plan to hear from different presenters to better understand what is true and what are misconceptions. Israel and Palestine cover what is often referred to as the Holy Land, and many of us have strong feelings about this land. Our goal today is to hear from the presenters, ask questions, and dialogue with each other. We ask that everyone remain courteous and respectful, because sometimes talking about this topic can bring a lot of charged emotions. This is a reminder to each of us to be considerate of our friends and neighbors here, and remember that we pray for a gathering that builds bridges and brings us closer together. With that, as a pastor, I would be remiss if I didn't also invite you, if there are times where you need space, the Arboretum is here, and I invite you to use it on such a beautiful day like this in Freeman. This is not a normal day for March in Freeman, and so if you do need that space, given a host of things that may be talked about, I invite you to take a moment and even just walk around the building in the beautiful weather. The first presentation of this series was about the religious significance of the Holy Land to each of the Abrahamic faiths. The second presentation was about the interactions between the 3 faith traditions and the Holy Land throughout history. The previous 2 presentations are available to view on our YouTube channel, the Freeman Network for Justice and Peace, as well as this one will be when we're done today. Now, enough of me. Let's introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Zachary Foster is a historian whose research explores the idea of Palestine, as well as the origins of Palestinian identity in the 19th century. He holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He is the founder of the digital archive Palestine Nexus and writes the newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox. Dr. Foster is a frequent contributor to international media outlets, including the Israeli newspaper Haaretz and TRT, the national public broadcaster of Turkey. I now present and invite you, Dr. Foster, to share when you are ready all that you have ready.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. In the next hour or so, I want to provide an overview of Zionism, of the Zionist movement, of Zionism as a political ideology. And I want to start off the story of Zionism in the 16th century, because I think this is really when really it's fair to talk about the origins of Zionism as dating to the 16th or 17th century. And And I would place the origins of the Zionist movement with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. This is a time period when Christians in Europe are challenging the church. They're challenging the teachings of the Catholic Church, and they're saying we need to return to the roots of Christianity. We need to read the Bible literally. It's a movement of literalism. The Bible does not need to be filtered through the Catholic Church. We can go read it and access it and understand it ourselves. And so Christians look into the Bible, and there it is in Genesis chapters 12. There it is in Deuteronomy. There it is in various other books. God promised the Holy Land to Abraham and his offspring. And this is really the beginning of the movement of Christians who say, who call for the establishment of a Jewish kingdom, a Jewish state, a Jewish polity, Jewish presence in the Holy Land, in Palestine. And that movement really picks up steam in the 17th century, 1640s, 1650s, 1660s in England. You have a movement known as the Restorationists, and they call for the restoration of Palestine to the Jews. They don't know much about who is living in Palestine at the time. Of course, it's overwhelmingly non-Jews, but that doesn't really bother them. And this movement of European Christians, primarily Protestants, again, primarily Protestants in England, calling for the restoration of Jews to Palestine, continues into the 18th century when Napoleon invades Egypt, conquers Egypt, then he invades Palestine in 1799. And once again, he repeats this idea that calling for the establishment of a Jewish commonwealth in the land of Palestine. Again, this is at a time when there are very few Jews living in Palestine. Perhaps 5–10% of the population of Palestine at the time is Jewish. But he believed that by calling for the establishment of a Jewish commonwealth in Palestine in 1799, that this would this would encourage Jews around the world to join his fight, because he's struggling to take over Palestine. He's facing fierce resistance from Ahmed Jazar Pasha and other local Arab Ottoman rulers. And then this story continues in the 1840s. You really, I would say, really, for me, the 1840s is really the origins of modern political Zionism that we know today, where you have a movement, again, primarily in Britain, of British Protestants calling now for not some Jewish rebirth or Jewish restoration. Now they're explicitly calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in a land that is 95% non-Jewish. And the primary reason is because is theological. They believe that at the end of days, Jews will congregate in the Holy Land, and this will bring about the second coming of Christ. And so it's a theological position, and the position becomes more and more widespread in Britain in the 19th century. I'm not talking about a handful of priests or pastors. I'm talking about dozens, if not hundreds, of European Christians writing about, speaking about, talking about in church, in books that they publish, in pamphlets that are circulating around Europe. They're all calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in a country, in a land that is 95% non-Jewish. The first Jewish Zionists to speak of really come about in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. This is before political Zionism. And these Jews, some of them are talking about, they're talking about a kind of philanthropic Zionism, that we want to build Jewish colonies in Palestine in order to provide work to destitute Jews, right? It's a kind of philanthropy. Now, Maurice de Hirsch was one of the leaders of this, you could call it philanthropic Zionist movement. But again, because the whole point of the philanthropic Zionist movement in the 1860s and 70s was all about solving the problem of Jewish destitution, well, for Maurice de Hirsch, he could do that anywhere. In fact, he was doing it in Palestine, he was doing it in Argentina, wherever he could find land to resettle destitute Jews, provide them work, provide them security and safety. He was doing that. But there's really no philanthropic Zionist movement to speak of beyond the 1880s and 1890s. That movement basically ceased to exist in the 20th century. Instead, what you saw was essentially political Zionism. Political Zionism was an ideology that developed again in Europe in, let's call it, really the 1890s with Theodor Herzl, who publishes a tract called The Jewish State, Der Judenstaat. He's a German journalist. He's Austrian. His native language is German. He sees himself first and foremost as German. He has no desire to ever live in Palestine. He sees Europe and German culture as high culture, but he believes that Jews will never be accepted as equals in Europe, and thus Jews need a place they can call home. They need a safe and secure place, and he sees that. And so, by the way, he is actually open to establishing a Jewish state in many places, in Uganda, perhaps Cyprus, perhaps Sinai. But in the end, after a number of different proposals that were presented before these Zionist congresses in 1897 and 1901 and 1903, all of these other ideas for where to establish a Jewish state effectively fail. And that's because, for historical and religious reasons, the only place you could actually convince Jews to move to was Palestine. And that's why the Zionist movement, of course, settles on Palestine, because, of course, as you probably all well know, the Holy Land is critical to Jewish theology, to Jewish tradition, to Jewish history, and thus that is the place where you can actually convince Jews to move to. And so, beginning in the 1880s, you get a movement in Europe to send Jews to Palestine. You have these Zionist clubs opening up all around Europe, primarily in Eastern Europe, known as Bilu or known as Rovevei Tzion. And they're recruiting people and they're sending them off to Palestine. And in Palestine, you have these Jews who are establishing agricultural colonies and just moving to the urban centers of Palestine as well, beginning, like I said, in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s. And thus, on the eve of World War I, you have something like 10% of Palestine is Jewish. Whereas, historically, let's say in the previous couple of centuries, 17th, 18th, 19th century, you're talking about Palestine being something like 5–10% Jewish. And so, and so that is the case. And so on the eve of World War I, you have this movement gaining steam, but it is not without challenges and rivals. And I would like to dwell on this for a moment. What is the reception of this new Zionist movement among Jewish and non-Jewish communities in Europe, in the United States, in the Middle East, and elsewhere? Well, in Europe, the overwhelming majority of Jews are actually opposed to Zionism. Let me repeat that. In the first few decades of the Zionist movement's existence, from the 1880s until the 1910s, the overwhelming majority of European Jewry oppose Zionism. Why is that? Well, I would say the main reason, especially in Western Europe, in places like Great Britain, France, Germany, is because Jews are trying to integrate into their home societies, their home cultures. They want to assimilate. And so they see the Zionist movement, and by the way, this is also true of the United States. They see the Zionist movement as a threat to their ability to integrate into the United States, France, Great Britain, Germany, etc. Because they're worried that they will be perceived as a fifth column. They're worried they will be accused of having dual loyalties. And by the way, you even hear this trope today when Donald Trump says something to the effect of, if you Jews really supported me, if you Jews, knew it was in your best interest, you would support me because I'm best for Israel. Meaning, Jews only care about Israel, and thus, if you want to support a political candidate, you should support the political candidate that supports Israel. So you see this trope even today. But they were all worried that the status of Jews in their home countries would be threatened by the Zionist movement, and that's why in 1885 the reform movement, in American Judaism we have a few major movements. The largest today is known as the Reform movement. In 1885 they issued the Pittsburgh Platform, which was the defining document, almost a founder's charter for the movement in the United States. And in that document, in that 1885 platform, they explicitly call themselves, they explicitly reject Zionism. They say, we want to have nothing to do with this movement. We want to be American. We're trying to assimilate in the United States. Please don't tell us we belong somewhere else, that we have to move to Palestine, that's where we belong. No, we belong in the United States. We want to be equals in the United States. And by the way, in 1917, after the Balfour Declaration, The Balfour Declaration being that infamous declaration that Great Britain made in 1917, calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And then when they took over Palestine in 1918, they implemented that declaration and thus facilitated Jewish immigration to Palestine and facilitated Jewish land purchases in Palestine. So in the aftermath of that declaration, Woodrow Wilson also came out in support of it, Woodrow Wilson being the president of the United States at the time. And 299 of the most prominent American Jews in 1919 signed a petition rejecting the Balfour Declaration because again, for the same reason, they were trying to assimilate in the United States and perceived Zionism as a threat to their ability to integrate into the United States. The same was true in Europe, where in 1917, after the British government declared the Balfour Declaration, there was one member of the British cabinet at the time who rejected that decision. And by the way, it was the only Jewish member of the British cabinet. His name was Morgethu. He rejected the Balfour Declaration for the same reason that the American Reformed Jews rejected it, for the same reason that the 299 signatories, American Jewish signatories of a document rejecting the Balfour Declaration rejected it. Again, because Morgenthau wanted to be British. He wanted to integrate into Britain. He did not want to be perceived to be associated with some foreign movement, belonging to having dual loyalties. The same was true in Germany and in Italy. The overwhelming majority of German Jews and Italian Jews rejected Zionism well into the 1930s. Again, for the same reasons. There was actually, and then we didn't also talk about the religious Jews. And of course, you have many, huge percentage of Jews around the world are religious. And overwhelmingly, the religious Jews also reject Zionism. And by the way, many still do today. The Satmar Hasidim, you're talking about 100,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews, many of them living in Israel, many of them living in Boston, New York. They reject Zionism very explicitly. Why? Because just like Christians, Jews also have eschatological beliefs. And just like Christians, many religious Jews also believe that at the end of days, Jews will gather in the Holy Land, that this is part of the end of days prophecy, but only God can decide when that end of days come. And anything humans do to try to pull that future forward, to try to engineer the second coming of the Messiah, or in the case of the Jews, it would be the first coming of the Messiah. Anything that a human being, a Jew, does to try and engineer the coming of the Messiah is heretical, because that would mean that you're playing God's role. And that was the view taken by virtually all Jewish religious authorities, all the rabbis, all the Talmudic scholars, virtually all of them. There was no debate about this for 1,800 years. It was a heresy. And in fact, there were many Jews over the years that actually called for the reestablishment of a Jewish kingdom in Palestine. One of them, his name was Shabtai Tzvi. And he was declared a heretic by the Jewish religious authorities of his time. And in the end, he, at threat of, the Ottoman Empire basically threatened him they threatened to execute him because he was causing trouble in the empire, and he converted to Islam, and that was that. But basically, this has been a common theme in Jewish history. Someone comes around and claims they're going to bring about the Mashiach, the Messiah, and they're going to move to Palestine. And they're either burned at the stake or they're rejected by or excommunicated by all the major Jewish religious leaders at the time. Again, because in traditional Jewish law, I mean, in halakha, that's what it's called, Jewish law, it is a total heresy to try to take the role of God, to try to do something that the Jewish tradition deems that only God is allowed to do. And that's why, like I said, many hundreds of thousands of Jews today reject, religious Jews today, not just the Satmar Hasidim. You also have Neturei Karta. You also have other ultra-Orthodox sects that may not be as explicitly anti-Zionist as the Neturei Karta or the Satmar Hasidim are, but they're just non-Zionist because they say Zionism has nothing to do with of halakha and Jewish law. It has nothing to do with the Torah. It has nothing to do with the Talmud. It has nothing to do with the Mishnah. It has nothing to do with keeping Shabbat, keeping kosher, wrapping tefillin every day, wearing tzitzit. Right? It has nothing to do with Jewish prayer. It has nothing to do with celebrating the Jewish holidays. Zionism is a fundamentally, again, this is the perspective that these religious Jews would take. They would say, Zionism is a secular nationalist movement. They have secular symbols. They have secular holidays. In fact, it's actually a heresy, they would say, because Zionists come around and say, you don't have to keep a Shabbat. You don't have to keep a kosher. You don't have to wrap tefillin every day. You don't have to pray 3 times a day. No, forget about all that stuff. That's what the traditional Jews do. No, Zionism says, no, all you have to do is be a new Jew. What does a new Jew mean? No, just move to Israel and, celebrate Israel's Independence Day and wave an Israeli flag. These things have nothing to do with Judaism, right? But and that's why they might even say Zionism is a heresy, because it's going to lead you astray. It's going to lead you away from Judaism. So those are some of the reasons why the traditional Jews, the religious Jews, rejected and still do reject Zionism. Then you might say there was a third reason why many Jews in Europe, as well as Jews in the Middle East and Jews in the United States, rejected Zionism. And that was because they saw Zionism as a rejection of class solidarity. These were socialist Jews, communist Jews. And in fact, in the Russian Empire, the Bund, as it was known, was the largest Jewish political party in Russia, was founded in the early 20th century, I believe 1903, if I'm not wrong. And the Bund absolutely rejected Zionism. They despised Theodor Herzl. Why did Theodor Herzl, being the founder of political Zionism, the guy who wrote the book, Jewish State, calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine? And they despised Theodor Herzl. Why? Because Theodor Herzl, in, I believe, also 1903, perhaps, no, maybe it was 1905, he travels to the Russian Empire, and he meets with these Russian czars, von Plev, the foreign minister of Russia at the time, who a few years earlier made a statement to the effect of, I wanted to carry out a genocide against the Jews, but I wasn't able to because the world wouldn't let me do it. So instead, I'm going to support Zionism to push all the Jews out of the Russian Empire to Palestine. So that's von Plev, the foreign minister of Russia. Herzl goes and meets with him. Okay. And Herzl, because Herzl and von Plev have shared interests, right? They have shared goals, shared desires. They both want to send all of the Russian Empire's Jews to Palestine for different reasons, obviously. Von Plev is an anti-Semite. He thinks Jews are filthy, they're scum, they're the money grubbing, they're the financiers. They're causing all these problems, right? Because he's anti-Semitic. He wants to rid the Russian Empire of Jews. Well, guess what? So does Theodor Herzl. Of course, he has different reasons, but he also wants to rid the Russian Empire of its Jews, send them all to Palestine. So they had shared goals and shared desires. And by the way, the Bund, the Jewish Socialist Party in Russia, is horrified by this, because the Bund sees this von Plev character as their greatest threat. Because von Plev is trying to kick out all the Jews out of the Russian Empire. Those Russian Jews have no desire to be ethnically cleansed and expelled from their homes and the places they've been living in for centuries. No, they want to integrate. In fact, that's why they embrace socialism and communism, because they see socialism and communism as a much better solution to the quote-unquote Jewish problem, the problem of anti-Semitism, the problem that these European societies refuse to allow Jews to integrate into those European societies. And that's why Jews are attracted to communism, and that's why they're attracted to socialism, because it's a solution to the Jewish problem, because from a communist or a socialist perspective, religion is quote-unquote the opiate of the masses. It's irrelevant. It's a distraction. And so they're obviously attracted to these ideologies like socialism and like communism, which treat them as equals. And so anyways, that is another reason why Jews in places like Russia reject Zionism. By the way, in the United States, it's the same thing. The American Jewish left in the 1920s and 1930s is socialist. For them, it's all about class solidarity. They perceive socialism to be the solution to the quote-unquote Jewish problem. And again, they're also horrified because they see Zionism as trying to undermine class solidarity. Because to a Zionist, the major difference in the world is not a capitalist versus a worker. It's not the major difference is not the person who owns the means of production versus the person who's helping to work and to generate those that capital to make the owners of the means of capital wealthier. No, to a Zionist, the major difference in society is religion, ethnicity, right? It's either you're a Jew or you're not. It's all about building a Jewish state to ensure Jewish prosperity and guarantee a Jewish domination, right? It has nothing to do with class. And that's why many Jews also reject Zionism for that reason. And they could say there's a fourth category of Jews who also reject Zionism, and that is for humanitarian reasons. And these are people like Morris Jastrow, who in 1919 publishes a book. He's an American Jew, originally from Poland. And he says, and this is not a direct quote, but I'm paraphrasing. He says something to the effect of, look, in Palestine, you have Jews, you have Muslims, you have Christians. I think he uses the word Mohammedans, which is how Muslims are called in the 1920s. And he says, look, but how are you going to create a Jewish state when you have all these other nationalities, all these other religions? Obviously, that's going to cause problems. Well, obviously, trying to create a Jewish state in a country that's 95% non-Jewish is going to cause problems. He wrote that in 1919. And so you could say there were at least 4 reasons why Jews around the world oppose Zionism. And now I want to talk about non-Jews. What was the non-Jewish reception of Zionism? Well, like we already said, many, if not most, of the most prominent anti-Semites in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries were raging Zionists. Many, if not most, of the most anti-Semitic Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, going all the way up to 1930s, 1940s, they were Zionists. Why is that? Well, first, they had shared goals, as we said. The founder of the anti-Semitic movement in Hungary, his name was Istoczi. He gives a speech in 1878 before the Hungarian parliament, calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, because he sees Jews as a problem. They're destroying Hungarian society. They're the financiers. They're leeching, right? They have this attitude about Jews that they just leech in whatever societies they live in. So we need to get rid of them. We need to remove Jews from Hungary. In fact, he's responsible for many pogroms in Hungary in the 1880s and 90s. And he was a raging Zionist. The same was true of Wilhelm Marr, who is the person who's a German journalist. He actually coins the term anti-Semitism. He believes in racial anti-Semitism, that Jews are a different race. And he is a raging Zionist as well for the same reasons. And then, of course, Arthur Balfour, the most famous anti-Semitic Zionist in history. Again, he's the author of the Balfour Declaration, as we already said. That declaration that was embraced by Britain after it conquered Palestine during World War I, calling for the establishment of a Jewish state. And then, Arthur Balfour, 12 years earlier in 1905, he's the Prime Minister of Britain. In 1917, he's in the cabinet, but he's not prime minister. But 12 years earlier, he was actually prime minister. And he sponsors legislation known as the Aliens Act in 1905. What is the Aliens Act? It's legislation designed to keep Jews out of Great Britain at a time when Jews are being slaughtered in the thousands in pogroms in Poland, in the Pale Settlement, in Odessa, in Ukraine, in Hungary. He's one of the world's leading anti-Semites. And he's a raging Zionist. We already said Woodrow Wilson was also a Zionist, calling for supporting the Balfour Declaration in 1917 and 1918. He's also an anti-Semite. He believes in white supremacy. He believes white people. It was well known at the time. Some of his favorite movies at the time were these blackface and plays. He loved watching plays with blackface. He was a racist. He believed white people were superior to non-whites, and he was a raging Zionist. By the way, you might even say many of the earliest Jewish Zionists themselves were also anti-Semites, or perhaps better said, they internalized the anti-Semitic stereotypes. They internalized the negative associations about Jews. And that's why they embraced Zionism, because they believed that Jews needed to reform themselves. I'll give you a few examples. Theodor Herzl, he's the founder of Zionism. He believes in establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. In 1898, I believe. In the late 19th century, he publishes a tract called Die Maschel. Die Maschel is a German word. It's a derogatory term. I think you might say the closest translation in English would be the word kike. That's the name of the pamphlet. It's an 19-page pamphlet he publishes in German. The first sentence of the pamphlet reads, "Any Jew who is not a Zionist is a Maschel." For him, the Jews who rejected Zionism were were filth. They were disgusting because they rejected this new movement, this idea that we need to, remake the Jew. We need to abandon our exile. We need to, basically refashion our self-identity. Because Jews have this, again, it's an anti-Semitic belief that the Jews are weak, they're passive, they're downtrodden, they look down in the streets, right? They just accept whatever these European societies have in store for them. And these Zionists, like Theodor Herzl, like Max Nordau, like Arthur Rupin, they embraced those stereotypes. That's why they became Zionists. They said, we need to refashion ourselves. We need to remake the Jew. And you can even see this kind of toxic, almost, I don't know if toxic masculinity is the right description of it. Perhaps it is, because you have Max Nordau who spearheads this ideology called muscular Zionism. Again, because the Jews in Europe are perceived to be weak, downtrodden, they don't like sports, they're not muscular, they're not strong, they don't till the soil. And so Max Nordau says we need to remake the Jew into someone strong and muscular and tough. We don't accept submission. We're going to fight back. And you see that attitude. You see that is a thread. That is a theme. That is a trope that is embraced by all the early Zionists, and you see it carrying through all the way today in the TikToks that Israeli soldiers post as they carry out war crimes in the West Bank and Gaza and Lebanon and Syria. So you have so many. So I think at this point, I think we should move on and kind of carry the story forward. And so you have all these Zionists that are moving to Palestine. About 70 or 80,000 or so moved to Palestine by the end of World War I. And then in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, many hundreds of thousands of Jews moved to Palestine. That number picks up, especially after 1933, when Hitler comes to power in Germany, and Jewish communities around the world are horrified. There's a spontaneous boycott of Nazi Germany among all the Jewish communities in the world, except for one. That was the Zionist community in Palestine. They didn't boycott the Nazis. In fact, they established a partnership with the Nazis known as the Ha'avara Agreement. Again, because they had shared goals and shared dreams. Many of the earliest Nazi ideologues, people like Alfred Rosenberg, they were raging Zionists because, again, for the same reason, they wanted to rid Germany of those filthy Jews. Zionists also wanted the German Jews to move to Palestine. And so they had this shared goal and shared vision. And thus they signed an agreement in which German Jews could move to Palestine and even transfer some of their assets to Palestine, so long as they so long as they bought German manufactured goods with those assets. And so between 1933 and 1939, when the agreement collapsed, obviously, about 60,000 German Jews are able to move to Palestine. And those German Jews are buying German manufactured goods, propping up the Nazi government, as as every other world Jewish community is horrified, boycotting the Nazis. And you have this real infighting among Jewish communities. The basically pro-Nazi, pro-Zionist faction versus the anti-Nazi, anti-Zionist factions. Now, this obviously comes to a head in 1939 when the Nazi regime embraces a final solution and Jews are sent off to the gas chambers and murdered in the many millions. By the late 1940s, the British realize it's time to pack up and go home. They're winding down empire in India and elsewhere around the world, and they're doing the same in Palestine. And they leave Palestine and just basically leave it up to the Jews and the Palestinians to just duke it out, fight it out. Whoever wins, wins. We don't want to play a role. We have no desire to maintain our colonial presence in this country. And so they leave. And at the time when they leave, the country is about 1/3 Jewish, 2/3 Palestinian. Of course, the Jews had migrated to Palestine through colonial violence, right? It was through British violence that enabled Jews to move to Palestine against the will of the political will of 85% of the population, right? Because as we said, the Zionism is all about establishing a Jewish state in a non-Jewish country. It's about establishing Jewish control in a country that's overwhelmingly non-Jewish. And when the non-Jews of Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs of Palestine, were polled in 1919, it was an American King Crane Commission. This group of Americans travels around Palestine and said, who do you want to control Palestine now that the Ottoman Empire has collapsed? 85% of them in that King Crane Commission, they say, we reject Zionism. But the British didn't care what the locals thought. The British didn't care about democracy. They didn't care about political will. They rejected the political will of 85% of the country. And they said, we don't care what you think. We're going to facilitate Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases to Palestine. And thus, Jews went from 10% of the population in 1918 to about 33% of the population in 1948. There's another thing I want to say about the Zionist movement in the 1980s, 90s, going all the way to 1940. There's a common myth here that the aim of the Zionist movement was to rescue Jews fleeing persecution. I think this is perhaps the most insidious lie told by Zionists today. The Zionist movement was not about saving Jews from destitution or poverty. It's not about saving Jews fleeing persecution. That's a myth. And let me cite some examples. Arthur Rupin was the head of the Zionist office in Palestine from the 1910s to the 1920s. And the way it worked, if you were a Zionist in Europe in 1895, in 1904, and you wanted to move to Palestine, what you would do is you would apply to the Palestine office. You're sitting in Odessa, Ukraine. You want to move to Palestine. You apply to the Palestine office, and you say, I want to move to Palestine for XYZ reasons. About 61% of Jews who applied to the Palestine office were rejected. And the number one reason for their rejection was destitution. The number one reason Jews were rejected from Palestine between 1880, 1882, and 1918, the number one reason is 61%. Those are the numbers. This is research that came out a few years ago by a Zionist historian. This is not political history, by the way. It doesn't really matter what your political views are. These are actually Zionist historians writing this history. The number one reason for the rejection was because these Jews were too destitute. The Zionist community in Palestine didn't want destitute Jews, poor Jews, impoverished Jews, Jews fleeing persecution, Jews who've been robbed of their livelihoods. They didn't want those Jews. No, why would they want those Jews? The goal of Zionism, as we said already many times, was to establish a Jewish state. Well, to establish a Jewish state, you want capital, you want wealth. You want wealthy Jews. You don't want Jews that have dependencies. You don't want impoverished Jews. Those Jews are going to make it harder to establish a state. And by the way, this continued in the 1920s. In fact, many of the most impoverished Jews were actually sent back to Europe. And there was a few years in 1926 and 1927, the Zionist community in Palestine sent more Jews back to Europe than Jews moved to Palestine. Again, because they were causing problems for this Jewish community in Palestine, right? They were needy, they had dependents, they had little kids, they were sick, they were unhealthy, they got malaria. What did the Zionist community do? They sent them back to Europe. You're causing problems for us. You're burdening us. And that was the attitude of the Zionist community. We're not talking about random Zionists who thought this. We're talking about the leaders of the community. Chaim Weizmann said in 1920, and this was his perspective really well into the 1930s. You could say up till 1933. His perspective was, we oppose mass migration. They didn't want a flood of poor immigrants to migrate to Palestine. This was especially the case after 1920, because in 1919 and 1920, you had basically these waves of pogroms in Ukraine in which tens of thousands of Jews were either killed or maimed or lost their livelihoods. I believe, actually, if you include Jews who lost their livelihoods, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of Jews in Ukraine. Actually, those were the Jews that really wanted to move to Palestine. They were all rejected. Chaim Weizmann said, do not allow the Ukrainian impoverished refugees into Palestine. They will make it harder for us to establish a Jewish state. This movement was not rescuing Jews from persecution. It was about building a Jewish state in Palestine. And to the extent that rescuing Jews fleeing persecution assisted that goal, they were allowed in. But to the extent that it inhibited the goal, they were rejected. And by the way, that's why David Ben-Gurion, really, you could say the leader of the Zionist community in Palestine from the mid to late 1920s, all the way, going all the way into the 1950s, right? He was the first prime minister of Israel. So he's the principal Zionist architect. He is the, chief executive officer of Zionism for, he's the George Washington and the John Adams and the Thomas Jefferson all wrapped up into one person, right? But David Ben-Gurion in 1938, was in 1939, right after the Kristallnacht pogrom, the pogrom in which about 90 Jews are murdered in Germany, right? It's a massacre. The night of broken glass, that's what Kristallnacht translates to, where Jewish shops are rampaged and pillaged, Jewish homes are destroyed, 90 Jews are murdered. After that pogrom, Great Britain reluctantly adopts what is known as the Kindertransport. They basically allow 10,000 German children Jews, to migrate, to move to Great Britain, because as is becoming obvious to everyone, this Nazi regime is, clearly posing a major threat to the Jews of Germany. So they let in 10,000 German Jewish children. And Ben-Gurion, in a meeting of the Zionist Executive Committee, so the leaders of the Zionist community in Palestine get together in response to this in 1938. And Ben-Gurion tells the other leaders in the meeting, including people like Moshe Sharet, he says, if I could save all the Jews of Germany, but those Jews would move to Great Britain, or if I could only save half of the German Jews, but the half that I'm able to save come to Palestine, well, I choose the latter. I choose only saving half of German Jews and letting the other half be slaughtered, because the half that I saved are able to move to Palestine. So don't be fooled for a minute. This movement was never about saving Jews. It was about saving Jews to the extent that saving Jews helps us build a Jewish state in Palestine. But to the extent that they move to Great Britain, then it's not helping us. So to hell with them, let them die. And that was the perspective of the Zionist community in Palestine well into the 1950s. In the first 2 to 3 years after the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948, all these Jews, actually, let me back up a bit. Basically, between 1945 and 1948, you have all these Jews that moved to Palestine, right? They're refugees, and they found refuge in Palestine. And many of them, by the way, actually want to go back to Europe, right? That's where they're from. They have family left behind in Europe. They want to reunite with their family. They want to try and claim lost property, right? So they want to leave Palestine. The Zionist community in Palestine worked diligently to prevent Jewish refugees living in Palestine from going home. They prevented and this is the case from 1945 well into the early 1950s. All these Jewish refugees, many of them wanted to stay in Palestine, but many of them wanted to go home. The Zionist community refused to let them go home. Why? Because this wasn't about helping Jews, encouraging Jews to live their best lives, ensuring Jews can reunite with their families. That's not what Zionism was about. Zionism was about establishing a Jewish state in a non-Jewish country. To do that, you need Jewish bodies. You need Jewish headcount. As many Jews as you can get. So these Jews that wanted to leave, they were prevented from leaving. They were weaponized. They were used as demographic hostages. And so what happened in 1948? Israel declares itself a state. It declares itself a Jewish state. But the problem was that according to the partition plan in November 1947, when the UN, remember the British, they decide we're leaving Palestine. This is a mess. We don't want to be in Palestine. They hand the situation over to the UN. The UN says, we're going to partition Palestine into 2 states, Jewish and Arab. But the problem for the Jews, they accepted the plan. But the problem for the Jews was that the Jewish and the Arabs, by the way, rejected the plan, which we can talk about in the Q&A. But the problem for the Jews was that the proposed Jewish state had something like 55% Jews, 45% Arabs, which is a razor-thin majority of Jews. And this was a problem because, again, the Jews wanted to establish a Jewish majority. Because if the only way you can ensure it's a Jewish state, in other words, that Jews have extra rights, extra privileges, that Jews can move from abroad to the state, the only way you can guarantee that is if you have a Jewish supermajority. That you're not always worried Palestinians outbirth Jews. And so what are you going to do? You have all these Arabs, you have all these Palestinians in the proposed borders of the Jewish state. What do? Well, Zionists, this wasn't the first time Zionists were asking themselves what to do with all these Arabs. They'd been asking this question already going back to the 1890s, when Theodor Herzl wrote in his diary in 1895. So this is even before he publishes The Jewish State. He wrote in his diary, he himself realized there were hundreds of thousands of non-Jews living in Palestine. What are we going to do with them? He said in his diary in the 1890s, we're going to spirit the penniless population across the border and try and find work for them in Jordan or Egypt or Lebanon. And this has been a question that every Zionist leader asked themselves in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s. There's no exceptions. They all ask themselves this question because it's the question, right? How do you establish a Jewish state in a country that's overwhelmingly non-Jewish? Israel Zangwill was publishing articles in Zionist newspapers in Davar throughout the 1920s, basically saying, well, we're gonna kick them out. We're going to buy land for them in Jordan, and we're going to force them across the Jordan River, where they're going to be happy because they're going to have more land than they could possibly dream of. Right? He thought that they would benefit from this, and thus he was openly advocating for transfer. That was the word used at the time. Today we would call that ethnic cleansing, or forced displacement. But that was openly talked about among Zionist leaders. 1930. The Weizmann-Rutenberg proposal. It's a secret proposal because most Zionist leaders are smart enough to realize that it's probably best that we talk about this quietly behind closed doors. And so Chaim Weizmann, who's the leader of the Zionist movement abroad, proposes to the British government in 1930. He says, how about we transfer, again, those are their words, 90,000 Palestinian Arabs across the Jordan River into Transjordan. And then throughout the 1930s, there's dozens of other proposals. You have a proposal by Joseph Weitz in 1937 and 1938. David Ben-Gurion, again, the leader of the Zionist community, he's also talking about transfer. Moshe Sharet, Arthur Rupin, they're all talking about quote unquote transfer because they all understand that they want to build a Jewish state. They want to have a Jewish majority, but there are just too many Palestinian Arabs living in the country. What are we going to do with them all? I mean, ideally, they'll leave on their own. Ideally, voluntary transfer is always the best, right? Because forcible transfer is going to be forcible transfer is obviously going to be very violent for them, but whenever you carry out violence against someone else, it's going to have blowback. So we would obviously rather them just leave on their own, but they all understood the problem. Everyone understood the problem, no exceptions, zero exceptions. The entirety of the movement, from the Zionist left to the Zionist right, understood the problem. And thus, what happened in 1947-48 when the British leave, the Zionist community adopts Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet is a plan that was called for basically the removal of Palestinians in the areas that the Zionist community wanted to take over and create a Jewish state in. And thus, beginning in April, really beginning a few months earlier, already in February, March, April of 1948, Zionist forces, you're talking about these Jewish militias in Palestine that were called terrorist organizations by the British because they carried out all kinds of acts, killing innocent civilians in marketplaces and hotels and cafes. These Jewish militias, they go village to village to village, expelling Palestinian Arabs by force because they're of the wrong religion. It didn't actually matter if they were hostile to the Zionist community or if they were friendly to the Zionist community, because ultimately they were of the wrong ethno-religious identity. That was the underlying problem. And so about 500 Palestinian villages were destroyed in 1948 by Zionist forces. By the end of the war, about 3/4 of the population of Palestine were expelled from outside the borders. By the way, many of them left on their own because there's a war going on. Who wants to be caught in the crossfire? There's shortages of supplies, food. No one wants to be stuck in a war zone, so people leave on their own. But the reason why it's expulsion is because none of them were allowed back. As you all know, at the end of a war, people should be allowed to go back. People should be allowed to return to their homes. Just like Israeli Jews should be allowed to return to their homes in the north of Israel or in the south of Israel at the end of the war, just like Lebanese should be allowed to return to their homes. Obviously, Palestinians should be allowed to return to their homes too, but they were not allowed, again, because they were of the incorrect religion. And so what did Israel do after 1948? It placed landmines around Gaza, and many dozens, if not hundreds of Palestinians, in their attempt to return home, were slaughtered, killed by those landmines. And about between 2,700 and 5,000 Palestinian Arabs were killed between 1949 and 1956 in their attempt to return to their homes after the war. These are overwhelmingly unarmed Palestinians trying to go reclaim property, trying to see relatives that they were forcibly separated from, trying to again reclaim lost property. Between 2,700 and 5,000 Palestinian Arabs were ruthlessly slaughtered after the war for carrying out the crime of trying to return to their home after the war, again, because they were of the incorrect ethnicity. There's another misconception here that Israel is this small state, and it's born and it's just surrounded by a sea of hostile Arabs. But in fact, throughout the 1950s, Israel continued to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. One of the great myths of I would say kind of the story of 1940 is that it was a kind of one and done thing. So Israel, they pushed out all these Palestinians, then they created a state, and that was the end of it. False. Between 1949 and 1959, so during the first decade of the establishment of the state of Israel, they forced out another between 30,000 and 40,000 Palestinian Arabs through different methods. In some cases, they aggressively sought to buy their land and push them out. In some cases, they just forcibly expelled them, rounded them up by gunpoint and said, "Get on the bus or I kill you." That was the case in Majdal in the south in 1950. About 11,000 Bedouin were expelled from the country during this time, again, because they're of the wrong ethnicity, they're of the wrong religion. They needed to go. They were a security threat. They're a demographic threat. They don't belong in the state. Israel also confiscated the properties of all those Palestinian refugees. So we're talking, the estimates vary, somewhere between 4 million dirhams and 7 million dirhams. You're talking about, a massive amount of property, all of it confiscated, never returned. The Palestinians who were displaced and made into refugees, they were never compensated by the state of Israel to this day. And I think thinking about kind of the threat of Zion, and then of course in 1967, what is Israel? Israel conquers the remainder of Palestine that it did not conquer in 1948. And there were already plans among Zionist leaders like Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir in the beginning in 1963. Israeli leaders started to talk about. They started to develop contingent plans for taking over Gaza and the West Bank. In 1967, they take over those territories. And so really for nearly 80% of the history of the state of Israel, it's been in control of millions of Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, those two territories that we hear about so much, denying them political rights, denying them the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, right? Denying them freedom of movement, denying them basic human rights, right? The right to have a fair trial, right? The right to be brought before a civilian judge, right? So Israel conquers Gaza and the West Bank in 1967, imposes a brutal military regime on those Palestinians. They're not allowed to wave a Palestinian flag. That's why, by the way, the watermelon becomes a symbol of Palestinian identity. Because it's illegal to wave a Palestinian flag in 1969 or 1973 or 1984. It's illegal to even paint a painting using the colors red, green, black, and white in the occupied Palestinian territories from 1967 to 1993. And that's why Fathi Rabin, a Palestinian artist, sat 6 months in an Israeli prison in the 1980s for painting a painting using those 4 colors. It was illegal to name an organization using the word Palestine in the name. It was illegal to organize 10 people for a political purpose in Gaza and the West Bank. It was illegal to plant a citrus tree without approval of the Israeli military. It was illegal to collect rainwater via a cistern in the occupied Palestinian territories from 1967 to 1987. Israel set up checkpoints. Israel denied Palestinians freedom of movement in the territories. Israel controlled the education system. Israel decided which textbooks were allowed to be used in Palestinian schools in the 1970s and 1980s, which were not allowed to be used. Israel carried out mass arrests. For example, in 1976, they used to arrest 34,000 Palestinians. So it's a belligerent military occupation for 20 years. And what happens? Revolt, the first intifada, in which Israel enters Gaza and Palestinians revolt. There's an open, of course people are going to revolt being denied rights for decades and decades. And it's an overwhelmingly unarmed revolt, unarmed. You're talking kids throwing stones at tanks, right? That's the classic image of the first Intifada, the first uprising that lasted from 1987 to 1993. And it was during the first year of that Intifada where the Israeli army enters Gaza. And from late 1987 to late 1988, the Israeli army kills 142 Palestinians in Gaza and suffers 0 casualties. It was a slaughter. And guess what organization was founded amidst that slaughter? Hamas. By the way, the leader of Hamas, his name is Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. When he was 13 years old, he was violently ethnically cleansed from his home in what became Israel and forced to Gaza. Well, three decades later, he founded the organization that carried out the atrocities on October 7th. The other co-founder of Hamas, Abdulaziz Rantisi, when he was 8 years old in the Gaza Strip, his uncle was rounded up when Israel invaded the Gaza Strip in 1956 and occupied it for 5 months. We didn't have time to talk about that. But Israel invades Gaza, rounds up all the men above the age of 15 in Khan Yunis, lines them up against a wall and slaughters them. It's a massacre. Abdulaziz Rantisi's uncle was massacred when he was 8 years old. He bore witness to that. 3 decades later, he co-founds Hamas. The same is true of Yazuri. Yazuri was also a refugee. He's also the third co-founder of Hamas. He was also violently ethnically cleansed from his home as a child. One only wonders how many 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old children, after having witnessed 15, 16 months of relentless slaughter, of forced starvation, of dehydration, of freezing cold, of hypothermia, one wonders how many children in Gaza will become the next Abdulaziz Rantisi, will become the next Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, will become the next Yazuri. So that's kind of the first Intifada. I'm going to wrap in just a few minutes because I realize we're out of time. The thing I want to focus on in just the last few minutes is that, Israel is a Jewish state. What does it mean to be a Jewish state in a country of many, many non-Jews? Well, it means that Jews get extra privileges. It means Jews get extra rights. And so you have about 900 municipal councils in Israel whose population is 99.7% Jewish, even though Israel's 20% non-Jewish. Well, that's interesting. Why is that? Well, that's because on the admissions councils of these 900 municipalities in Israel, these admission councils are allowed to deny someone the right to live in those municipalities because that person may be unsuitable. This is the language of the bill, this law. They may be unsuitable for life in a rural community. It's subjective. It's just they can decide this person is not suitable for life in a rural community in Israel. Well, guess who's deemed non-suitable? The non-Jews. And that's why the population of those communities is 99.7% Jewish. If you're non-Jewish in Israel, you face systematic discrimination in every aspect of the economy and society. Palestinian schools are underfunded relative to Jewish ones. Palestinian municipalities are underfunded relative to Jewish municipalities. The state of Israel builds development projects for Jews all the time. There's hundreds and hundreds of new Jewish municipalities and settlements and communities established for Jews in the history over the past 76 years. Virtually none are established for Palestinians. The state is set up to guarantee Jewish prosperity, Jewish interest. And so Palestinians are at best a demographic problem and are at worst a security threat. The vast majority of Jews in Israel think Palestinians are a fifth column. That Palestinians are a problem. The fact that they have a pulse is a problem because they don't have J-positive blood. They have P-positive blood. So they're a problem. And this is fundamentally why Zionism has come under so much attack in recent years. Is because when you have an ideology that says the point of this state is to serve Jewish interests and guarantee Jewish prosperity and guarantee Jewish development and guarantee Jewish safety. But what about all the non-Jews? What about all the Palestinian Arabs? What about them? They're just not part of the story. Their lives just don't matter as much. And that is ultimately why Zionism has come to be critiqued so much in recent decades. And I'll wrap there. And I think we're going to open up to Q&A. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foster. I can just pull this out, right? Yeah. So we do want to offer a chance for folks to ask questions. And so if you do have a question you'd like to ask, please just raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you. And yeah. And if you don't mind, do a little introduction too, just so there's a little reference.
My name is Tim Waltner. I'm a resident of Freeman. Thank you for your comments. Could you speak to the United States' role in Zionism?
Every single U.S. president, from Woodrow Wilson, going all the way on down to Harry Truman, who recognized Israel 7 minutes or 8 minutes after it was founded. Then President Eisenhower, and then obviously Kennedy, you could say, was the first U.S. president that really supported Israel and began to send arms to Israel. And then support for Israel just went on steroids in the United States ever really since the 80s, 90s. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You could say the first reason, and perhaps the historical reason for the United States' support for Zionism, is that it's an extension of the British support for Zionism, which says the British supported Zionism as a kind of colonial outpost. It was a sort of a Western outpost. We believe that these Jews who were European had the same ideology as us Europeans, right? And thus are natural allies and have natural affinity towards us. And that was the case in the United States as well. I mean, many of the earliest Zionist leaders, they were Americans. Golda Meir, right? She was raised in Wisconsin, spoke American English. She was the fifth prime minister of Israel. And the ones that weren't American, they were Anglo. Abba Eban, first foreign minister of Israel, Israel's ambassador to the UN, he was South African. Chaim Weizmann was British, right? All these, critical Zionist leaders, they were themselves from the West. And of course, the United States, just like every other great part in the world, is trying to extend its tentacles everywhere in the world, trying to expand its influence. And so what better, what could be better than actually just having a kind of Western outpost in the Middle East, where they're going to represent our interests? So that was kind of the historical reason why the United States at first supported it. There was also that theological reason that we talked about. Woodrow Wilson was a Christian, and he supported Zionism for Christian reasons. Harry S. Truman was, you could basically say he supported Christian Zionism, for the same reason that all of those restorationists did, because for eschatological reasons he supported Zionism. And then you could say during the Cold War, the support maybe stemmed from this belief in, well, you're either with us or you're against us, and it's our job in the world to support all the non-communist countries in the world. And thus Israel was perceived as a Western bulwark against these socialist communist countries in Egypt and Syria. But really, I would say in the past few decades, the main reason is, I would say, is because of the Christian Zionist lobby, whose primary representation today is Christians United for Israel, 10 million member strong organization founded by John Hagee, who in 2003 published a book calling Adolf Hitler a half-breed Jew sent by God to push the Jews to Palestine. So you had Christians United for Zionism supporting Israel, and that's a massive demographic block. You're talking tens of millions of Americans either openly identify as Christian Zionist or support these organizations like Christians United for Zionism. Then, of course, you have AIPAC. AIPAC is a masterful lobby organization. They spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars every campaign season, helping elect pro-Israel members to the U.S. Congress, helping elect pro-Israel U.S. presidents. They play an enormous role in U.S. politics. Politicians are fearful that if they stand up against Israel, they will be taken down, just like Cori Bush was taken down by AIPAC in the 2024 November elections, as was Jamal Bowman, taken down by AIPAC for calling for a ceasefire. There's political. And then you of course have the arms lobby, the Raytheons and the Lockheed Martins and the Caterpillars. War is great business, right? We all know that. So you have the weapons manufacturing companies all cheering on Israel. More money to Israel, more billions of dollars sent to Israel every year means more money for the weapons lobby. There's so much to say about this topic, but maybe I'll pause there just to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Foster. Another question.
Thanks for outlining my name's Spencer Bradford. I'm a minister here in Freeman. Thanks for outlining very clearly the secular ideological origins of Zionism. I'm curious about your take on the current nature of the relationship of religion and Zionism within Israel and the West Bank. We've seen this uptick, this increase in settler violence toward Palestinians in the West Bank since the Gaza war began, and their growing influence of religious parties in coalition with Likud over before the war and for a number of years. It just seems a significant shift in a country where prime ministers could not get elected unless they were avowedly atheist for decades and decades, and where the religious Zionism was seen as a fringe element in society. Could you address some of this shift?
It's a great question. And again, there's so much to say here. I would date the shift in Israeli politics from a secular dominated politics to increasingly a religious dominated politics to the early 2000s. Call that after the breakdown of the Oslo process in 2000, when the Camp David Accords failed to bring about a negotiated settlement. You had renewed violence. You had a second intifada. Without getting into the details of that uprising, about 1,000 Israeli Jews were killed. This was the most violent period. They were killed by Palestinian militants, most of them civilians, in cafes and buses. And of course, at the same time, the Israeli military killed 3,000 Palestinians, also mostly civilians. Israel's always disproportionate in its violence, but nevertheless, this was a very gruesome period for Israeli Jews, and all Israelis. And this had a radicalizing effect on Israeli society, obviously, a radicalizing effect that we see that carries, you can draw a straight line from, I would say, the second intifada all the way to the present day. Beginning in 2005, 6, 7, you get these polls coming out of Israeli society that are quite shocking. 50% of Israeli Jews refuse to live in a building with an Arab in a 2006 poll. 2007 poll, 60% of Jewish youth say they don't want to be in a class with an Arab. By 2000, you also start to see this kind of almost casualness of genocidal language being thrown around in Israel. You had Ehud Olmert's son. He's a politician on the Israeli center left, the Kadima party. This is in 2012. He says, flatten Gaza. He says, there are no innocents in Gaza. The same phrase that Isaac Herzog said in December 2023. You start to see Israel turn to the right. I mean, Netanyahu was elected in 2009, and say for a brief period of in 2022, when Naftali Bennett was prime minister, who's equally right-wing, the right has dominated Israeli politics for 16 years. And again, this is based on this belief, true or false. I mean, obviously I would call it fiction, but this belief in Israeli society that they're all terrorists. All they want to do is kill us. They just hate Jews. All of them are anti-Semites. The only solution is lock them up and throw away the key. That was the attitude towards Gaza. That increasingly became the attitude towards the West Bank as well. Encircle them, close them in, build a wall, prevent them from leaving, put checkpoints at the entry and exit points of every village. And so it was less and less interactions between Palestinians and Israelis. They're no longer in the same. They're no longer interacting in shops and marketplaces, on buses and cafes. They don't see each other anymore. And so this also has a radicalizing effect on Israeli society. There's so much to say, but yes, you're absolutely correct. The turn to the right, the embrace of religion, obviously is also demographic, right? Religious Israelis have 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids per family. Secular Israelis have 1, 2, 3 kids per family. So they're just growing they're becoming a larger and larger percentage of the total number of Israeli Jews, as a percentage of total Jews. So that also played a role.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
My question is, I've a little experience in living other cultures in Greece and South America. And is it correct to label the Palestinians as the indigenous of the area? Because the indigenous historically and to this day around the globe are suffering, not maybe to the extent that you're telling us about, but that's the question.
Gotcha. Yeah, indigeneity is it's a tough term to define. Here's what I will say. On the eve of Zionist immigration to Palestine, so we're talking 1880s, Palestine, there's about, call it 500,000 people living in Palestine, okay? About 80% of them are Muslims, 85% are Muslim, 10% are Christian, 10% are Jewish, right? That's the rough breakdown. The people living in Palestine, how did they identify themselves? Beginning in the 1890s, they started to call themselves Palestinians. That's actually the topic of my dissertation research. I spent 8 years researching that topic. So they started to call themselves Palestinians. Before that, they would have called themselves Arabs or Muslims or Christians or Ottomans or the inhabitants of Jerusalem or the inhabitants of Syria or the inhabitants of Palestine, the people of Palestine. They might have said, or they primarily just identified with their local, the most local of all local identities, their family, right? Or even their city, their village, their family. Those were the most important identities. And then zooming out, obviously their religious identity was extremely important, Christian, Muslim, Jewish. And then obviously these broader identities like Arab or like Palestinian started to become more important in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, and so on. Are they indigenous to Palestine? Of course. They were living there, for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. In fact, there's even, I don't like getting into the DNA evidence, but if you really want to kind of trace lineages, you can look at these DNA tests and see, where's your lineage traced to. And Palestinians have been living in this land for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. So yes, I would say it's fair to say they are indigenous. But again, Jews will come along and tell you they're also indigenous, right? Because 2,000 years ago, there was a Judean state in Palestine, right? So, I just don't think it's a particularly useful question to even talk about indigeneity. It's because it can get weaponized and politicized. I would rather just talk about human rights and talk about, who has a legitimate right to rule. And talk about international humanitarian law, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. None of those things say anything about indigeneity, which is not a concept in international humanitarian law.
Thank you. I think we still have a few minutes for any questions.
Delmer Hofer, and I have a question about the two-state solution that's been talked about and for the future of that area. You want to comment on that?
Certainly. So right now there's one state between the river and the sea, right? It's the state of Israel. I think the state of Israel controls everyone between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, right? They control everyone in Gaza, as we just saw, I think 24 hours ago, Israel cut off the electricity to 2 million people, preventing the water treatment facilities from operating properly, preventing raw sewage from being filtered. thus leading to waterborne illnesses and death among Palestinian children and adults. It's just a blatant, flagrant war crime. Basically what I'm saying is Israel controls everyone between the river and the sea. And it's it's not that there's, there are these territories over here and there's Israel, and inside Israel it's democratic, and over there it's, okay, we need to figure out what to do with this other territory. No, that's a mischaracterization of the reality, because it's not that there's like a separate Israeli prime minister that governs the West Bank and Gaza. No, it's all governed by the same government, the same cabinet, the same military, the same prime minister. It's all the same thing. It's all one entity, and it's all controlled by one person, Bibi Netanyahu, with a single chain of command. It's not like there's a separate chain of command to control Gaza and the West. It's all one thing. And that one thing isn't, there's this idea of two-state. In my opinion, saying the word two-state solution is a misnomer, because it pretends as if we're all just sitting around waiting for a solution. The solution is the present. The present is the reality. The reality is that there's a single state where, you have 7 million Israeli Jews who have full rights in that state. You have about 2 million Palestinians who are, have many rights, but not all rights. And then you have 5 million Palestinians, 3 million in the West Bank, 2 million in Gaza, who have no rights, none. They can be arrested, thrown in prison forever without having been charged with any crime, without having committed a crime, without being charged with a crime, and they can be, and their imprisonment is renewable indefinitely. So there's one state in which you have many different categories of people who have different rights, and I just don't see a world in which Israel's ever giving up control of anything between the river and the sea. So there will always only be one state, in my opinion. Just because I just can't envision a world where Israel's ever going to give up any real control anywhere between the river and the sea. I mean, does there look like a movement in Israeli society calling for two states now? Yair Lapid, right? Who, as well as, by the way, there was a vote brought before the Israeli Knesset a few months ago. Even the far left Jewish Israeli party Meretz voted against the quote-unquote two-state solution. There is no such thing as a two-state solution. It's completely dead. It has been rejected by Israeli Jewish society. It still has some support among Palestinians. It still has apparent support in the West, in Europe, in the United States. But no Israeli Jew takes that idea seriously anymore. They've thrown it away. We can't give Palestinians control of anything. But they're all terrorists, right? I mean, that's the view in Israel. So there will never be any real Palestinian control between the river and the sea. I'm just being realistic. I'm just telling you what Israeli Jews are telling you, who control the society. So if there's never going to be a Palestinian state, well, then what we need to do is talk about equal rights within the state that exists between the river and the sea. That's not because I don't believe in Palestinian liberation. That doesn't mean I don't believe that Palestinians deserve to have a state of their own. No, of course I do. But you're just delusional if you think Israeli Jews are going to give Palestinians real sovereignty. And so for me, the only solution is it's actually incredibly simple to solve everything. You just say, I don't care what your religion is, everyone's equal. It's a shocking principle, one everyone in the United States presumably believes in, one everyone in Europe presumably believes in, but one that everyone in Israel disagrees with and rejects, which is equality. And by the way, everything, like the problem would basically go away tomorrow if you just give everyone the same rights. I don't care what your religion is, what your ethnicity is. If you live between the river and the sea, you're all equal. I mean, and that's to my opinion what the inevitable result of all of these wars and all of this occupation. Israel has made it impossible. The occupation is permanent. It's not going anywhere. Look at the maps of settlements and settlers. It just goes up and to the right forever and ever and ever. More Israel-only roads in the West Bank. More Israeli only settlements in the West Bank. More occupation infrastructure. More walls. More checkpoints. More destruction. Israel is not leaving the West Bank, and they're not leaving, and maybe Gaza is a slightly different story, but the West Bank is effectively part of Israel. And now it's just a question of, is Israel going to give the people under its control equal rights? That's the question for me.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
If Netanyahu should suddenly have a heart attack and die, what would happen?
Who's deputy prime minister under Netanyahu? Gosh, is it Israel Katz, the defense minister? I don't actually know, but presumably nothing would. I mean, there's this false impression that the problem is Netanyahu. You'll hear oftentimes Democratic politicians say this. Senator Chuck Schumer said this, was it a year ago? Netanyahu's got to go, right? Because if Yoav Gallant took power, things would be different. If Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, which Israeli leader is going to take Benny Gantz, who bragged in 2014 about sending Gaza back to the Stone Age? Which Israeli leader is going to do anything differently than Netanyahu's doing? Maybe they'll be. It's like, do you want genocide with a side of green beans or mashed potatoes? Right? There's no fundamental difference between the positions of Netanyahu and any other major Israeli leader. No Israeli leader is calling for an end to occupation. No Israeli leader is calling for an end to the siege or the blockade on Gaza. No Israeli leader is calling for withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon or Syria. They all have the same view. They have the same underlying view towards the Palestinians. They disagree perhaps on other issues with regard to internal Israeli Jewish politics, like should we conscript the ultra-Orthodox Jews or not? Should Israel be more of a secular state or a Jewish state, or a religious Jewish state? What is our attitude towards homosexuality, right? They disagree on those things, but do they disagree about the Palestinians? No, there's total consensus on that.
I think we have maybe time for one more question. So I do want to give that warning, but we can also end in this space as well. Oh, sorry. There.
Thank you, Dr. Foster. And thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. My question is, every Israeli citizen, are they, okay, let me back up. So in America, we are Americans, but we view certain positions and actions of the government as unjust, unfair. It's not the right thing to do. So even though we're Americans, we don't necessarily agree with everything our government does. Do you know anything about what happens on the ground in the civilian life, in Israel? Does that phenomenon exist? If you know any, just your thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, there's great hostility towards Israeli leaders inside Israel. They're very vocal in their criticism of the prime minister. In fact, on the eve of October 7th, so in the 13-month period before October 7th, 2023, you had the largest protest movement in all of Israeli history. We're talking hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews protesting in Rabin Square in downtown Tel Aviv every Saturday night for 13 months. You even had all calling for Netanyahu to resign. Why? Because he was working on legislation known as the judicial reform. I mean, reform is a euphemism, obviously, right? The plan was to delete the judiciary, which in Israeli society is the only checks and balance on the decisions made by the Israeli cabinet. The Israeli Supreme Court, prior to this judicial reform agenda, had the ability to overrule a decision made by the government, and they were trying to remove that veto ability, and they still are. And it's this reform agenda is ongoing. It's probably going to get passed. And many Israeli Jews were obviously very upset about that, right? Because Israel is devolving into an autocratic state. I mean, in many ways, it already is, obviously, right? It's already ruling 5 million Palestinians without giving them any rights at all. So in a sense, it already is autocratic. But now it was going to become autocratic even to its Jewish population. And that was very unacceptable to the kind of the secular leftist Israelis. Leftist, whatever that means in the Israeli context. So, of course, Israelis are very critical of Netanyahu. Obviously, since October 7th, there's been a massive movement of Israelis, especially the hostage families, the families of the Israeli hostages in Gaza, protest every single week in front of his office. They throw at slurs at him they would never even call Palestinians. That's probably untrue, but they are extremely hostile to him because they believe he is dragging on the war for his own political reasons, and they believe he is the primary reason their loved ones are still hostages in Gaza. Because it's pretty, I mean, everyone is aware of this at this point, that Netanyahu is the obstacle. He's been the one preventing a deal for months and months and months. I mean, even Israel's right wing, the Jerusalem Post, okay, with very right-wing newspaper, a pro-Netanyahu newspaper, in July 2024 ran a headline: Netanyahu is actively sabotaging peace talks or hostage deal talks. I mean, he is right. So yes, of course, Israeli Jews are very critical of their own leaders. It's a very vibrant society within the confines that we all agree, Jews are superior to Palestinians. As long as we all agree that, we can have vociferous arguments and debates.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foster. I think we need to just take a moment to give him another round of applause for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to make sure to invite you all. There are plenty of refreshments and drinks over to the side. Please continue conversation. Did you want to offer, Dr. Foster, one final word as a goodbye or anything for? That's my job. That's beautiful. I can do that. Dr. Foster, thank you so much for your time. You are welcome to continue in all the work you're doing. Thank you so much for all that you have offered us, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you all so much for having me. Take care.
As I said before, there are plenty of resources, even if you just want to review them and look at what there is and order stuff online on your own. Please, of course, consider a donation today. Are there any other notes I want to make sure to offer to you? Oh, you can, of course, look at the recording online. So if there were things you missed today, please visit the Freeman Network's YouTube channel and you can review this video. I know there were lots of names that Dr. Foster shared I was not familiar with, and I would not have had the time to note everything. So I will probably be reviewing it myself. With that, I would like to offer a prayer to send you all out this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in prayer. Almighty God, great Creator, enduring in grace and mercy, thank you for your blessing on our time together. Guard us as we leave this place, invigorate us in reflection, and inspire us to seek justice and peace for all of humanity. Amen. Thank you all. Go in peace.